مشاهدينا الكرام، أرحب بكم في هذه الحلقة الجديدة من برنامجكم بكل وضوح. معكم رشيد، وأرحب بكم على قناة الكرمة وعلى مواقع التواصل الاجتماعي. موضوعنا لهذه الحلقة يتعلق بسؤال تاريخي يتعلق بالإسلام المبكر، وهو: هل نشأ الإسلام في البتراء؟ والسبب السبب في أن هذا الموضوع مطروح من طرف باحث كندي اسمه جيبسون. وفي الحقيقة أنا كنت قد عملت استجواب معه في منذ تقريبا حوالي سنة وأكثر في الماضي، وقد تطرقت لهذا الموضوع معه بخصوص هل نشأ الإسلام في البتراء. دعوني أتطرق لبعض النقاط قبل أن أعرض محتوى الحوار، وهو بالإنجليزي ومترجم باللغة العربية subtitling، يعني عناوين ترجمة تحت بالنص، لكن لمن يريد أن يسمعه بالإنجليزي أيضا سيكون باللغة الإنجليزية. الأسئلة التي عندي في هذه الحلقة، أنا سأود أن أمر بعجالة على ما يقوله المراجعون revisionist، يعني بيسموهم المراجعون اللي بيعملوا مراجعة للتاريخ الإسلامي أو التاريخ المبكر للإسلام. هؤلاء المراجعون ينكرون وجود محمد تاريخيا، ومنهم مجموعة إنارة ومجموعة يعني حتى داخل إنارة في توجهات، ومجموعات أخرى خارج إنارة أو أشخاص آخرون خارج إنارة. جيبسون ليس من هؤلاء، يعني هو لا ينكر وجود محمد تاريخيا، إنما يقول بأن الإسلام نشأ في البتراء، وأن نشأة الإسلام في مكة ليست هي الحقيقة التاريخية. هناك أيضا من ضمن المراجعين من يقول بأن أو هم أنفسهم أيضا الكثير منهم يقولون ادعاء ببداية الإسلام كبدعة مسيحية، بداية الإسلام كبدعة مسيحية. وأيضا ادعاء نشوء الإسلام في مكان غير مكة، أيضا هم يقولون بذلك، سواء البتراء أو غير البتراء. هناك من يقول العراق، هناك من يقول أماكن كثيرة. ادعاء أن محمد هو المسيح. أنا على علم بهذه التوجهات، لأن كثير من المشاهدين يقولون لي لماذا لا تتحدث عن هذه الأمور. في الحقيقة أريد أن أكون نظرة شاملة عن بداية الإسلام وتاريخه المبكر. ولحد الآن توجد دعني أقول يعني بعض العناصر المفقودة أو حلقات مفقودة في هذا التاريخ. طبعا التاريخ الإسلامي الذي وصلنا فيه ثغرات كثيرة، وليس هو الحقيقة الكاملة، بل هو حقائق مجتزأة وفيه ما فيه من الغث والسمين. وطبعا في مبالغة: من يكون محمد؟ كيف بدأت المنادات بالإسلام أول الأمر؟ هل فعلا تم الحديث عن دين في الأول أم كان غزو دون دين؟ كلها أسئلة لا زال لم يحسم فيها البحث التاريخي المجرد من الإيمانيات، المجرد من التقديس. هل أنا أنكر وجود محمد تاريخيا؟ أنا ضد مجموعة إنارة وضد مجموعة كبيرة من الباحثين، يعني أنا أقف على جانب آخر. أعتقد أن محمد كان موجودا تاريخيا، وأعتقد أن اسمه لم يكن محمد في الأول، ربما أضيف كلقب لاحقا للتقديس ولأشياء أخرى. وأعتقد أن الإسلام لم يبدأ كبدعة مسيحية. الذين يقولون أنه بدأ كبدعة مسيحية سأرد عليهم في حلقات أخرى. ويدعون أيضا بأن معاوية كان مسيحيا اعتمادا على النقود، علم نوميزماتيك أو نميات اللي بيسموه علم فحص النقود. طبعا هذا فيه إشكال، وأنه صلى في جثيماني، يعني في وثيقة مارونية أنه صلى في جثيماني، وأنه في العملات هناك صليب. طبعا كل هذه مردود عليه، ليس كل قائد مسلم صلى في مكان مسيحي سندعي بأنه كان مسيحيا. عمر بن الخطاب صلى في كنيسة القيامة أو أمام كنيسة القيامة كما يقولون، ومع ذلك كان مسلما. اليوم لو صلى شيخ الأزهر داخل كنيسة فهذا لا يعني أنه صار مسيحيا، لأنه يمكن للمسلم أن يصلي في الأماكن المقدسة للمسيحيين. أيضا مسألة النقود والعملات، حتى وجود الصليب قد محاه من شكله الصليب، وكان لابد أن يستخدم العملة التي كانت موجودة آنذاك، العملة البيزنطية، لأنها كانت هي العملة المتعارف عليها. فلو قام أي حاكم مسلم اليوم باستخدام الدولار فهذا لا يعني أنه صار مسيحيا، حتى لو كان فرضا أن الدولار فيه صليب. كل هذه الأمور مردود عليها. ادعاء نشوء الإسلام في مكان غير مكة، وهذا هو محور هذه الحلقة، وبالضبط البتراء سنفحصه فحصا دقيقا. ادعاء أن محمد هو المسيح، خاصة الكتابات على قبة الصخرة، لا أتفق مع هذا، بل أنا أميل إلى الرأي الآخر القائل بأنها مختارات من النصوص الإسلامية للرد على المسيحيين، وليس بالضبط أنها تعني المسيح. ليس يعني اسم محمد يعني المسيح، المحمد الممجد الذي هو المسيح. أنا أرفض هذا تماما، وأعتقد أنه تعسف في الشرح والتفسير ومبالغة لا حاجة لنا بها، وسأرد عليها في حينها أيضا. إذن كل هذه الأمور أنا خارج من هذه الدائرة، أتفق في بعض الجزئيات لكن أختلف في معظم الكلام الذي يقال من المراجعين. بالنسبة للأسئلة التي سأطرحها على ضيفنا في هذه الحلقة تتعلق بهل نشأ الإسلام في البتراء؟ لماذا لم يذكر أي مصدر أن البتراء كانت هي ميلاد الإسلام؟ لماذا سكتت المصادر سواء الخارجية أو الداخلية للإسلام؟ لماذا لم تظهر أي طائفة إسلامية تقدس البتراء؟ نعلم أنه إذا حصل خلاف على الأقل ستبقى طائفة، حتى لو اتهموها بالزندقة أو بالكفر، على الأقل ستبقى طائفة معينة تقدس هذا المكان الذي كان مقدسا عندهم في القرون الأولى للإسلام. لماذا لا يكون انحراف اتجاه القبلة؟ لأن جيبسون يعتمد على أن القبلة ليست في الاتجاه الصحيح في المساجد الأولى. لماذا لا يكون هذا الانحراف راجع إلى خطأ في التقدير، خصوصا أن الأدوات كانت بدائية؟ ثم لماذا لا نجد ذكر مكة كاسم للبتراء؟ لو كانت مكة هي البتراء لوجدنا هذا في مصادر كثيرة. كل هذه الأسئلة سأطرحها بطريقة أو بأخرى على ضيفنا، وسأعلق عليها حين يحتاج الأمر إلى تعليق. لكن لنتابع اللقاء، وكما قلت هو منذ أكثر من سنة مضت على هذا اللقاء، وكنت أضعه لحد ما يحين الوقت لبثه، وقد حان الوقت الآن، فلنشاهد جميعا. Our guest today is Mr. Dan Gibson. He's an author and a researcher in early Islamic history. And he wrote a fascinating book. Actually, he wrote 3 books. One of them, I have it here, is the Quranic geography. And Mr. Dan Gibson, he has a very unique view about early Islam, about the sacred city of Islam. And we are going to hear from him his view and also his main arguments to support his view. Thank you for being here, Mr. Dan Gibson.
Thank you. It's a joy to be here.
Your view, I followed your documentary on YouTube, and also I read your book, and I read several other articles, either agreeing with you or disagreeing with you. And let me say, it's a very challenging view. It's not what the mainstream Islam says about the early Qiblas and the first sacred city. So let's start from the beginning. What did you find out, and how did you find it?
Okay, I didn't start looking for this. It was something I just discovered as I was doing research. One section of my research was about the Qiblas that were facing towards Jerusalem. I thought this would only take a very short study,
Yes.
because as we know in traditional Muslim history, once Muhammad moved to Medina, it was only a year and a half before he announced that the Qibla had changed. And so there should only be one or two or three mosques that point towards Jerusalem. And as I lived in the Middle East, I was aware of several mosques where the people there said, this mosque faces Jerusalem. And so I thought I'll quickly do this study. As I began to look at various mosques, and I just started picking all the old mosques I could find, I made an amazing discovery that none of them faced Jerusalem. All of them were facing slightly south of Jerusalem. And as I expanded my study and kept looking for more and more mosques, trying to figure out what this is, because the problem is some are east, some are west, some are south, some are north. They're coming from all directions,
Right.
and they were facing south of Jerusalem. And these went on for the first almost 100 years of Islamic history. That's the direction that mosques faced.
So,
Now, let me just be clear that I had to eliminate some mosques because they had been torn down and rebuilt and
That's
torn
right.
down and rebuilt and enlarged. So I couldn't use those mosques because I couldn't tell the original Qibla direction. But there were many mosques that still survived that were not facing towards Mecca.
yeah. Let's go. So your main discovery that these mosques were facing somewhere else, not Jerusalem and not Mecca. And,
That's right.
And you concluded, I don't say just from this, but from other arguments, that the first sacred city or the sacred city of Islam is not Mecca. Can you tell us what did you find out concerning the sacred city?
Okay, well, Qibla studies are a bit complex because they didn't all face one other place. They faced several other places. So I had to put them all in order of date so we could get a picture of what happened, which ones, as they were built, where did they face. And I discovered that the earliest mosques all faced towards the city of Petra in southern Jordan. Well, actually, the mosques are not exact. So you end up having to draw a circle on a map because all the different Qiblas are coming into an area. You draw a circle, but at the center of that circle was the city of Petra.
Yes.
And now that was maybe a bit convenient for me, but I had been studying the city of Petra, wrote some books about it, and so I was quite shocked and surprised that this city that I was familiar with was also the focal point for the early Qiblas.
So do you think Petra was the sacred city of Islam?
I do. At this point, I do. We've now found over 30 mosques that face Petra. This is mosques or other buildings or even graveyards. So we're looking at the earliest sources. There are over 30. I've got 31, and there's some others that we're looking at that face this city of Petra. And these are the very earliest of the mosques and the buildings that are out there.
So قبل أن نستمر في عرض الانترفيو، يعني الحجة الأولى أن القبلات تتجه نحو البتراء ولا تتجه نحو مكة الحالية، وهذه هي الحجة الأولى. سأطرح سؤالا على الباحث جيبسون ويتعلق بماذا لو كان اتجاه القبلة مبني على وسائل بدائية، وسنسمع الرد. وأحب أن أنبه قبل أن أطرح السؤال ونسمع الرد، أحب أن أنبه أن في الحديث مثلا وفي التاريخ الإسلامي نجد أن الصحابة مثلا في المبسوط جزء 10 صفحة 185 مبسوط في الفقه، فإن الصحابة فتحوا العراق وجعلوا القبلة ما بين المشرق والمغرب، يعني لو كنت شمالا أو جنوبا فإن القبلة هي بين المشرق والمغرب، وفتحوا خراسان وجعلوا قبلة أهلها ما بين المغربين، مغرب الشتاء ومغرب الصيف، يعني بحسب متى تغرب الشمس في كل فصل. وإذا كان التحديد بناء على تقييم بدائي وليس بالأدوات كما يعني نعرفه الآن. واتجاه القبلة ليس شرطا أن يكون دقيقا، وهذا هو ردي على ما يقوله دان جيبسون عن أبي هريرة، قال رسول الله ما بين المشرق والمغرب قبلة، لو كنت في الشمال أو في الجنوب فكل ما بين المشرق والمغرب هو قبلة لك. وأيضا جاء في موطأ الإمام مالك نفس الشيء، ما بين المشرق والمغرب قبلة إذا توجه قبل البيت، وبالتالي القبلة لا ينبغي بالضرورة أن تكون دقيقة كل الدقة، وبالتالي نحن أمام هنا هل فعلا كانوا دقيقين في هذا الأمر أم لم يكونوا دقيقين. وهذه هي الخارطة التي استخدمها دان جيبسون في يعني في تحديد القبلة، ونرى أنه مثلا في هذه المناطق في شمال إفريقيا كلها تتجه في هذا الاتجاه، وبالتالي إذا كانت مكة هنا فكلها تتجه نحو مكة تقريبيا بدائيا. لكن لو أخذنا مثلا مناطق أخرى، خليني أضع لون آخر حتى لا يختلط بالأحمر، يعني في أماكن أخرى مثلا لو كانت القبلة مثلا المساجد التي هنا في هذا المكان كلها تصب في هذا الاتجاه، وبالتالي حتى لو ما كانتش متجهة نحو مكة فهي في الحقيقة متجهة نحو الاتجاه بتاع مكة. وكذلك نقول عن نفس هذه المساجد التي هنا إلى آخره. فهل هو الاتجاه أم مكة بالتحديد؟ هذا واحد من الإشكاليات التي نواجهها في الأدلة التي استخدمها دان جيبسون. خليني أسأله السؤال وبعد ذلك نكمل النقاش.
How about the counter argument that some people try to say that the first Qiblas were not precise because we didn't have the instruments that we have today? And let me tell you, I'm from Morocco, and not many mosques are really precisely towards Mecca even today. I came from a village where we just look at the east and we put the Qibla to the east. It will not be precisely 100%. You draw a line from there to Mecca. So how do you respond to that argument or counter argument?
Okay, I think there's a difference between village mosques and people praying in villages, and when they built large mosques, the Friday mosque or the congregational mosque, many of these were very large structures, and they worked hard to get their Qibla direction correct, because there were certain people that were called on to find the Qibla direction. And we find that even in Islamic history and some of the stories where they called on specific people to come and set to the Qibla because they knew how to do it. So when we look at large, important buildings, I think they worked hard to get the correct Qibla.
Did they have the instruments back to get it precisely? Probably there are some errors, even when you bring experts at that time lacking the tools we have today. Probably they can do some mistakes in locating the Qibla precisely.
Yes, and that's why when we have this circle, there are it's a circle of about 60 kilometers around, because you've got people who are not being correct. But I do think they had the technology. Now, here we have to work backwards, because we have Qiblas that faced Petra, we have Qiblas that faced Mecca, we have Qiblas that faced what is called a between position. This was developed by General Hajjaj, who built the first mosque to the between position called the Wasat Mosque, and so it's a between position. And in North Africa, and in Spain and in Morocco, you have what we call an African Qibla or a parallel Qibla, because they did not face Mecca as well. They used a different Qibla. So on the website that I have, we have something called the Qibla tool. You can go on and you can look at all 131 of these different Qiblas that we have measured in the first 300 years of Islam. And by looking at lots of data, we're not just reading from one or two mosques. I've been looking for every mosque I can find in the first 300 years of Islam. Also measuring some graveyards, which are not nearly as accurate, and measuring some major buildings and palaces and other things, some shrines that were built, measuring their Qibla direction, and that gives us a large picture. Now, the question is, could they do it? I liken this to the like the pyramids. I can look at the pyramids and say, well, how did they do it? And if I can't explain how they built the pyramids, I don't go around saying the pyramids don't exist. Okay, I have to say the pyramids are there. So we have people with their degrees in statistics who are experts who have looked at this and are looking at it now. There's even another paper under discussion looking at what are the possibilities that all of these Qiblas would end up facing four distinct places, four distinct types of Qiblas. The chances that this was just coincidence is just astronomical. It couldn't be coincidence. These are actually mosques with orientation. Now, in my latest book, which is called Early Islamic Qiblas, I have a whole chapter that goes through what did the Arabs know about astronomy and navigation. Remember, in the earliest days, the Arabs navigated over the desert, especially in the Middle East. They became wealthy because they knew how to travel the desert. They could go from Jordan to Babylon. They could then go down to Yemen and so forth. Now, in the desert, they had to navigate by the stars. And so they developed some very useful tools for navigation by the stars. And we have learned a lot about what they understood. They had methods to determine north, south, east, and west very precisely. And they also had what is called the Arab compass. This is over 220 points on the Arab compass, each one of them associated with the rising or setting of a star on the horizon. And so they could look at the horizon and they understood all of the different directions. They also counted steps in the desert. And so as they walked through the desert, they would count their steps so they knew how far they had come. North and south, they could measure how far up the North Star was using their fingers. This Isba, and they would measure Isba, how many fingers, and then they would measure the Zam, which are 8 sections on your finger. And they had several stars. They could double check if your finger was too fat or too narrow. So you could double check those against the distance between several stars. So they actually had good systems in place for being able to precisely get their Qibla direction within 3 or 4 or 5 degrees. It's never exact, but it's very close.
So when do you think the change happened and why? Why the sacred city, instead of Petra, in your opinion, became Mecca? When that happened and the reasons behind it?
قبل أن يجيب الباحث دان جيبسون على هذا السؤال، متى حصل هذا التغيير ولماذا؟ احنا شفنا جوابه عن مسألة هل كانت لديهم الأدوات. هو يقول بأنه كانت هناك الأدوات وكان هناك إمكانية أن يعرفوا بالضبط أين توجد القبلة، لكن في القرى مش مثل المدن، مش مثل المساجد الكبيرة. لكن أنا أحب أن أنبه هنا أن بعض النصوص تدل على أنه في كل مكان تقريبا كان هناك اختلاف في القبلات، وهذا الشيء اعترف به علماء الإسلام ولم يخفوه. أخذوه. وبالتالي أنا شخصيا لست مقتنعا بأنه دليل على أن البتراء كانت هي منشأ الإسلام. خلينا نشوف مثلا هذه النصوص بعجالة. اختلاف محاريب مصر، يقول المواعد أو المقريزي في المواعد والاعتبار، يقول في الجزء الرابع صفحة 26: أما اختلاف محاريب مصر فإن له أسبابا، أحدها حمل كثير من الناس قوله صلى الله عليه وسلم الذي رواه الحافظ أبو عيسى الترمذي من حديث أبو هريرة: ما بين المشرق والمغرب قبلة، على العموم. فالناس أخذوا هذا على أساس أنه توسعة في الأمر، وليس بالضبط يجب أن يحرصوا على اتجاه القبلة أن يكون محددا. أيضا المقريزي يقول: اعلم أن محاريب ديار مصر التي يستقبلها المسلمون في صلواتهم 4 محاريب، يعني 4 اتجاهات، أحدها محراب الصحابة الذي أسسوه في البلاد التي استوطنوها. في محاريب في اتجاهات كثيرة مختلفة، لدرجة أن أو يقول: أما محاريب مصر، محاريب الصحابة التي بفسطاط مصر والإسكندرية فإن سمتها يقابل مشرق الشتاء وهو مطالع برج العقرب. فكانوا يستخدمون يعني وسائل بدائية بحسب النصوص التي وصلتنا. سأتطرق إلى سبب مسألة واسط لاحقا حين يصل إليها، لكن الآن خلونا نتابع جوابه لماذا، متى حصل التغيير ولماذا، وخلينا نسمع بقية الحوار.
Now that was the surprise for me, because many of these mosques can be dated. We have records in the Islamic records. Maybe Al-Tabri tells us this, or maybe Ibn Hisham mentions, when a mosque was built or when the armies arrived in a certain place, and so when they constructed the mosques there. And so we have good dates, and some of them we can only say, well, within this, 60 or 80-year period, this mosque was built. Some are very exact. We have the exact day, sometimes the day and the month when the construction started. So I was very surprised at the late date because the Qibla changed away from Petra around 100 years after the founding of Islam. This is 100 years AH, after the Hijrah. So before that time, every mosque faced towards Petra. Okay, it's only after that time, getting maybe up to 80 after the Hijrah, 90 after the Hijrah. This is when General Hajjaj introduces this between Qibla, and about that time we have the very first mosque that has a Mecca Qibla that we can measure. There may have been a few before this, but up to this point, Mecca is not one of the options that we find in the mosques that we can record.
So 100 years after the Hijrah, the change started happening. Why, in your opinion?
I think the change started happening earlier. I put it about 70 after the Hijrah that the change started happening. I don't think large mosques were built until it was really established that this is Mecca. I think it was a slow, gradual change. And I put that down to a man named Ibn Zubair. This is Abdullah ibn Zubair. He had a brother and several others by that name, but he's well known as Ibn Zubair. And he was in the holy city, wherever that was, and he declared himself, well, because the people encouraged him to, he declared himself to be the Caliph. Now, there already was a Caliph who was in Damascus. And everybody was upset when they chose Damascus as the center of this new empire, because it should have been, in everyone's opinion, Mecca, or it should have been Medina, but instead it was chosen to be Damascus. And so there was a lot of people upset. There was a lot of open rebellion when he did this. And so Ibn Zubair was the first one. I believe he was in Petra. I believe that was the very first Qibla. That's where the Kaaba was. That's where Muhammad was born. That's where everything that took place that we know in traditional Islamic history, I believe we can trace it back to the city of Petra. He declares himself Caliph, and a war begins. Now, that war took several years. in the middle of that war, there was a lull in the war because the caliph had died, and then they had to call a new caliph, and he only lived a few weeks, and then he was killed, and then they had to bring in a new caliph. You know, there was a lot of turmoil going on in the Islamic world. During that time, Musa'ab ibn Zubair, that's the brother of Abdullah, brings many camels, horses, and baggage to the holy city. They have a big celebration. And at that point, the Islamic historians are quiet. For a whole year, nothing is said about what happened. And then what we do know is that just before this, Ibn Zubair had demolished the Kaaba building. He had taken the black rock and put it in a wooden stand with some silk around it. And the Kaaba didn't even exist because he had knocked it down. And he had wanted to construct a new Kaaba. So already the black rock was separated from the Kaaba building. And I think it is at that time that they decided to take the black rock and move it to Saudi Arabia. This actual thing is not mentioned in Islamic history because the people who won the war wrote the history. And Ibn Zubair didn't win the war. He survived for several more years. But by moving the black rock down into Saudi Arabia, he got it as far away from Damascus as he could possibly get it.
Why choosing Saudi Arabia? Why not another place?
I think he's looking for a place that had no history behind it. There were no people around. It was not on a caravan route. It was a more isolated place, but there was water. There was a well there. There was water, and they could go there. And I think in the beginning it was temporary. Let's go and put it there. Of course, you can imagine all the tribes around and all the people around would respond and go, oh, the black rock is here, the black stone. And so I think people started going to it, to see it, to touch it, to pray and so forth, and to revere it. And so already right from the beginning, there would be an attraction. Now, these people who had brought the black rock down there, they would also need to house these people who were coming and feed them. And so a counter pilgrimage, a very small one, would have started already to help support the people who were there. So the problem was that Ibn Zubair ended up being killed. He's still up in the holy city. He's killed. And the war continues because Hajjaj, he continues on because Medina is in revolt. And he has to go to Medina. And Kufa is in revolt. And so he has to go to Kufa. There's no time for the armies to go down into Saudi Arabia and find the Black Rock and move it. And unfortunately, enough years go past. We've got almost 10 years before they settle down this whole thing. By that time, the Black Rock is established in Mecca in Saudi Arabia, and people are going there, pilgrimage is going there, and people are not going up to Petra because it is in ruins after the war. Remember, Hajjaj had brought big siege weapons to knock down things. So things are smashed away. There's, catapult stones have smashed down the center of the city. And so this thing just gradually moved over. And so Islam at this point is divided into two, and you can find this reference in Islamic literature between the traditionalists and the reformers. And the reformers win out at the end, and so they end up with winning the war. But the rock is down in Saudi Arabia. And so now the Caliph has a problem. But one of his problems is still General Hajjaj. This is the guy who decimated the original holy city and who had gone on. And Hajjaj was brutal. He killed a lot of people. He even killed a lot of the companions of the prophets.
That's right.
They died at the hands of Hajjaj. Now Hajjaj becomes second to the Caliph, and he is put in charge of the eastern side of the empire. And so he builds his first mosque, and he has to decide what he's going to call this mosque and which Qibla will he choose. Will he choose for Petra, which has been destroyed? The rock is gone. Nobody's going there for pilgrimage. It's full of the idols of Dushera and Alat and Hubal, and all this is there. Or does he face his mosque to the new place where the rebels are, who he was fighting against? He doesn't choose either of those. He develops the Wasit Qibla in between the two, and he just points his mosque out into the middle of the desert, approximately between the two. After that, other people, remember, he's the governor, so other mosques being built choose the same Qibla. In the end, 22 mosques are built during his lifetime. Once he dies, that is the end of the Wasit Qibla, and it disappears. And later Islamic writers criticize the Caliph at that time because he allowed the Wasit Qibla to exist. And we can find that in Islamic records.
إذن عودة للحديث على أو التعليق على هذا الحوار. إذن بحسب الباحث دان جيبسون مشكلة الخلاف مع عبد الله بن الزبير دفع هذا الأخير إلى تحويل الحجر الأسود من هنا وتحويله إلى ما يعرف بمكة اليوم، وأن كان هنا في البداية. وأكثر من هذا أن الحجاج هو سبب هذه المشكلة، لأنه كان يعني متوحشا، وأنه في الأخير الحجاج لم يشأ لما أسس مسجده لم يشأ أن يوجهه إلى حيث البتراء حيث يوجد المتمردون، ولا القبلة الجديدة التي هي صارت مكة بحسب كلامه، وأسس ما يسمى بمسجد واسط. إذن واسط هي القبلة الوسطى في نظري. لكن حين نبحث في التاريخ الإسلامي نجد أن واسط لم تسمى بسبب وجود القبلة في الوسط. قيل في الروض المعطار في خبر الأخطار جزء الواو سميت بواسط لتوسطها بين المصرين البصرة والكوفة والمدائن، بينها وبين كل واحدة منها 40 فرسخا، فهي واسط. ليس لا يذكر أي مرجع أن سبب تسمية واسط هي قبلة في الوسط. وأيضا لكن انحراف قبلة مسجد واسط مذكور في التراث الإسلامي، تاريخ بغداد مثلا، أن أسد بن عمرو كان قال رأيت قبلة واسط ردية جدا وتبين ذاك لي فتحرفت فيها. كان معروف أنها منحرفة عن المكان الموجودة فيه. ما السبب في ذلك لا ندري بالضبط، لا تذكر المصادر الإسلامية، فعنده حق في هذه الجزئية، لكن جزئية تسمية مسجد واسط ليست صائبة. ويذكر لنا الجاحظ أن عبد الملك بن مروان وابنه الوليد وعاملهما الحجاج بن يوسف ومولاه يزيد بن أبي مسلم أعادوا على البيت بالهدم، يعني هدموا الكعبة، وعلى حرم المدينة بالغزو فهدموا الكعبة واستباحوا الحرمة وحولوا قبلة واسط. أنه هذا تحويل القبلة كان عمدا، كان قصرا. وحين نتأمل ما قاله دان جيبسون نجد هذه القبلة التي يشير إليها، وهذا هو مسجد واسط، يعني البتراء هنا يعني مكة في هذا الاتجاه تحت، فهي بينهما. لكن لو أخذت الحديث الذي اعتمدنا عليه فالقبلة ينبغي أن تكون في هذا الاتجاه فقط، يعني فليس من المفروض أن تكون بالضبط اتجاه مكة، ممكن أن تكون في هذا الاتجاه، وهذا مقبول في التراث الإسلامي أيضا لو كانت في الاتجاه حيث توجد مكة. فهل نقبل كلامه؟ أعتقد أنه نحتاج إلى المزيد من الأدلة، ولذلك سأدعه يكمل الحديث.
They criticized that Caliph. He said he allowed Hajjaj to develop the Wasit Qibla. So that is in history.
Let me play the devil's advocate here.
Please do. I I need to hear the questions.
So Mecca, in your opinion, is Petra, or it's a different city? Was Petra named Mecca?
I believe that the word Mecca was originally associated with Petra. The problem with Petra is that it has had many, many names down through history. The earliest name is Mount Seir, and we find that in the biblical record. We find that in the historical records. Josephus and the Roman historians use the name Mount Seir. They also use the name Rechem. It's called the city of Rechem. You can find Rechem mentioned once in the Quran as one of the great miracles of God, mentioned together with the seven sleepers. So
yes.
Yes, it is there, and people wonder what is Rechem. But Rechem, when I read it, go, oh, that's the name of the city, and it is a great crack down through the mountain, and in the middle of this crack, they managed to build this city, and so it's very impressive, and I can see why the Quran would refer to it as one of the miracles of God. So this city has multiple names over time. The Romans came along and they used the name Petra, which means the rock. But the Roman province was called Arabia Petrea, Arabia of the two rocks, because there was one called Sela to the north, and then there was this rock called Petra. And so that was a name used by the early Romans, but not everyone referred to it as Petra, especially the polytheists who were there, and the people who were not Roman didn't necessarily use the Roman name. So we have multiple names.
You have multiple, but you don't have any resource that names Petra Mecca.
I do. We do.
Which
we have
one?
a writer, Thomas Artsruni, who is an Armenian writing up about the same time as Al-Tabari is writing. And he writes, and he tells us about Muhammad. And so he's important because he's an early source that says Muhammad was a real person. And he says Muhammad, he puts him in Arabia, Petrea, Paran. He puts three words together. And he says, this man in Arabia, Petrea, Paran, and then he refers to the place and he calls it Mecca. And then he says, the Mecca, just so you get it right. The Mecca in Arabia, Petrea, Paran. Now, Paran is that early name for where Abraham sent Sarah and Ishmael, and where they went off and they lived in Paran. And you'll find in the Bible that the name of Seir and Paran are often combined together. Paran is the name for the wilderness, and Mount Seir is the name where Petra is, that great mountain where Petra is.
But Arabia, Petrea is a big place. It's not only Petra. So
it starts south of Petra and it went up as far as Basra in Damascus, in Syria. It was a Roman province. There were 3 Roman provinces. So there was Arabia Petrea in the north. Then there was Arabia Deserta in the middle, which is the desert. And then there's Arabia Felix, which is down where Yemen was. So these were 3 distinct Arabias that the ancients understood. Arabia Petrea puts it in the north. And so he's telling us that the original Mecca, the Mecca, he says, was in Arabia Petrea.
So
خليني أعلق على هذا. هو يستخدم شهادة توماس أرتستروني في القرن التاسع الميلادي، وهو كاتب أرميني، ويقول بأنه ذكر بأن مكة هي البتراء. لكن الرد على هذا أنه يضع مكة في البتراء العربية، وهي مساحة شاسعة وليس بالضبط في البتراء. ربما يكون خلط بين حيث توجد مكة الآن، خصوصا أنه لم يزور المنطقة وكان يتحدث من بعيد من أرمينيا، فهو بعيد جدا عن هذه المنطقة. وفي هذا الوقت كانت مكة خلاص، لأنه نتكلم عن القرن الثالث الهجري، مكة صارت معروفة للجميع. فهو لا يتحدث عن القرن الأول حتى نقول أنه يدعم فرضية دان جيبسون، فهو يتحدث عن وقته. وبالتالي مكة بالنسبة له توجد في البتراء العربية. هو واضح أنه أخطأ لأنه لم يكن عنده علم واسع بالجغرافيا، وهذا هو الرد عليه. السؤال لو كان هناك مصادر كثيرة تقول بأن مكة هي البتراء كنت سأتفق معه، وبالتالي حتى شهادة توماس أرتستروني ليست دليلا قويا. خلينا نكمل معه.
Let me assume that is correct. Then when the first, where the first hijrah happened, they went from Petra to where? So in Saudi Arabia, we have Mecca and we have Medina. So the Islamic mainstream history makes sense. They went from Mecca to Medina.
That's right.
So how are you going to fit the hijrah within this view?
They went from Petra down to Medina. Medina is Medina. It doesn't change. And so they went south and then north. That's the only change you have to make, where the other is Medina. Mecca is south of Medina, the modern Mecca. I call it Mecca 2. Mecca 1 was to the north. Now, that may surprise you, but think carefully about, for instance, in Medina, when the Quraysh attack Medina, you have the Battle of the Trench. Where did they put the trench? They put it north of Medina because of the Quraysh were coming down from the north. You find this again and again, that the Quraysh were north of Medina, and they go up to, they would fight a battle. They would go up to Khaybar in the north, and then they would go off to attack the holy city. And they're already way north of Medina, and that's where they attack it. The Battle of Mu'tah, if you remember the Battle of Mu'tah, were a very important battle. After the first battle, it was kind of a stalemate. So they said, let's go attack Mecca. And so they went off and attacked Mecca, and then they came back to continue on their battles with the Christian armies, the Roman Christian armies. Did they go from Mu'tah all the way down to Mecca in Saudi Arabia and then all the way back up to fight the next battle? It doesn't make any sense. The timing doesn't make sense. And there's numerous other stories of people who went on pilgrimage, and if the location of the pilgrimage was in Mecca and Saudi Arabia, the timing doesn't make sense. There's simply not enough time. There are armies that march down to Ibn Zubair to attack him. There's not enough time for the army to get all the way to Mecca, and they would have to have marched through Medina.
And another question that comes to my mind, why we do not have any Islamic sect that stayed faithful to Petra? Usually if something like this major thing happened, we will have some people who are saying Petra was our sacred city and we will stay praying towards Petra no matter what happens.
Yeah, okay. It's a slightly different what people argued, because Petra was destroyed by a massive earthquake, and also because of the war that took place. People had turned away from Petra, but there were later people called the Karmatians, and they are ones who, this is later, several hundred years later, writing just around the time of Al-Tabri, they were coming into being, and they were against going to Mecca. They said Mecca is not the true Qibla. They said Mecca is not the true pilgrimage. They tried to stop pilgrims from going to Mecca. And when that didn't happen, then they went to Mecca and they killed pilgrims and stuffed their bodies down the Zamzam well to desecrate it. And they got the black stone, they chiseled it out of the Qibla, they took it away and they kept it, and they said, don't go to Mecca. That's how strong the opposition was to going to Mecca. They had that stone for almost 20 years, but eventually they had economic troubles because nobody was trading with them and so forth. So eventually they grew weak, and they were offered a lot of money, and so they returned the black rock, but this time they had smashed it into 7 pieces. And if you go to Mecca today, you'll see the black rock isn't actually in 7 pieces. That's because of the revolt and the people who were upset with going to Mecca as the place of pilgrimage and as a Qibla direction.
Yes, but they never said we should go back to Petra. I mean, they rejected the Mecca, but they never said we should go back to Petra.
That's right, because, and even today, the first objection that people have with Petra when they go there, they say, it's full of pagan temples.
Yes.
And for them, they don't want Islam to be associated with a city full of pagan temples. Because when you come to Petra, I can take you there and show you the foundation of the original Kaaba. It is there in Petra. And we've measured it, and it fits the measurements that Azraqi gives us of the first Kaaba that was during the time of Muhammad. And so he measured all four sides have different measurements. It's not a square, and it doesn't sit exactly square, and those measurements fit exactly Azraqi's measurements. The problem is that there is a great temple right almost up against it. I mean, just not maybe 20 feet away is a great temple. This was the Temple of Hubal. This is explained to us in Islamic history, but most people don't read history. So they don't want, you know, a temple there. They don't want the Temple of Allah to be there. They don't want the Temple of Dusheira to be there. They envisage that here is this Kaaba building and this great open area. And Azraqi said the first Kaaba wasn't in a great open area. It was open on two sides, and on the other two sides was just a narrow way around the back. So everybody had to crowd around the back and then come around. And if you go to the Kaaba in Petra today, you'll see that the Kaaba building is more in the corner of the courtyard. You'll see that the wall that goes around the courtyard has a curve in it. This is the Hatim curve that goes around the graves of Ishmael and Hagar. But you just see the wall and you'll see the curve. We are told that it was much later, and it was after the Civil War, that Hijr wall was attached to the new Kaaba building that was down in Saudi Arabia. So we are told who attached that wall. We are told who put the wall, which caliph put the wall in the center of the courtyard. And all this. We're even told by an inscription found in Saudi Arabia of the year that they built Masjid al-Haram in Saudi Arabia. And that is given to us. It's about 80 years after the Hijrah. I should look it up to be exact, the year that's given. And this said this is the year that Masjid al-Haram was built here. And so there is written evidence. And again, that's we're now moving away from the Qiblas into other evidences.
Yeah, yes, I'm trying to bring other objections as well, because it's when you make a big claim, you need like very strong arguments here. This is one of the biggest claims against early Islamic history. One of them as well, one of the ideas or the questions that I have, why no Muslim scholar talked about this? The empire, the Islamic empire in Damascus, they had many enemies. You know, the Abbasids, they were against the Umayyads, and they were not friends. Yes. I mean, we could have seen some Islamic writers writing what they have done. They will be like, they destroyed Petra, our first sacred city, and they moved it to another place, and so on. But we find both sides who are enemies, the Abbasids and the Umayyads, both of them agreeing that Mecca is the holy city, not another city.
Yeah, they don't say the only city. They just refer to Mecca. Now, put yourself in the place of the writers. The writers are all writing under the Abbasids. Okay, they are not the earlier ones. So they are allowed to say bad things about the earlier caliphs that were in Damascus. That's fine. But they do say nothing bad about the religion of Islam. They do not slander their own religion. And remember, at this time, the caliphs who are under the Abbasids are trying to bring peace to everyone. It's a huge struggle for them because the empire is so far widely spread, and there's so many different factions that every year they're fighting everybody. You know, they're all coming up with these different, and so to unite them together, they have chosen the Qibla that seems to be the most popular at the time. And these very first Abbasid caliphs are the ones who go to Mecca. They're the ones who build the Kaaba there. They're the ones who add different things. And in their reigns, we can read all about the things that are being added. We can go to Mecca in Saudi Arabia today and see, yes, they were supporting that Kaaba. So I think it's the concept of honor and shame, that you bring honor to Islam and you don't bring shame to Islam. You can shame those caliphs, but you will not say anything against the Islamic religion. You will not say anything against your prophet. And so they would not mention this at all. It was just a quiet thing, you know, the saying that comes that with, you know, cover up shame. If there's something shameful, just cover it up, deny it, don't talk about it. And I think that was the approach that the Abbasids took. Just don't talk about this. We've now got Mecca, everybody praying towards Mecca. We're all united about this. Don't bring up these old arguments and these old things that would divide us.
I heard among your arguments that you used Surah 37 and the verses 136 to 138, that they pass by Lot's city, by Sodom and Gomorrah in the morning and the evening. And also you use the fruits of the Quran, that they are not reflecting Saudi Arabia's climate. They are reflecting more Petra. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Okay, I don't remember using those Quranic verses. I very much remember using the hadiths and the histories. Okay, so I think other people have come along and used those Quranic verses, which is fine, but I think that in the histories, it's much clearer, because when they mention fruit, like in the Quran, when they talk about fruit, it could mean cattle, it could mean fruit, and so forth. And people can argue, well, when they mention Sodom is close by, well, how close, and you know, and so forth. But in the hadiths, in the histories, they mention things like the soil that is used. Teen is used as a word here, not ramal. You know, they talk about the actual grasses that grow. They give us the names of the trees. They mention the fruit, like grapes. And they talk about a man who was a prisoner and he still managed to get grapes, you know, in Mecca. And it wasn't even the season, you know, and things like this. So, I mean, there's a lot of agricultural terms associated with the first Mecca. And so in my mind, that is much clearer. I think the Quran alludes to this, but people can argue different ways on what those verses in the Quran means. My struggle with the Quran is the Quran is seldom specific. It may say fruits, but it uses a word that is not going to give us exactly what kind of fruits. What are they talking about? Yes. The hadiths and the histories are usually much clearer in defining what kind of fruit, what kind of trees, what kind of grass are we talking about here.
Well, thank you so much. This was a deeply rich conversation. And thank you so much for being here.
كان هذا هو الحوار، وسأكمل مناقشة هذا الموضوع سواء في الحلقة القادمة أو الحلقات الأخرى من جوانب أخرى، خاصة بالنسبة لجغرافية القرآن والفواكه المذكورة وبعض الآيات الأخرى. وأتمنى أن نكمل الحوار على مواقع التواصل الاجتماعي بخصوص هذا الموضوع. ألقاكم في حلقة أخرى، وإلى اللقاء.